Well, it is an honor to be entrusted with the opening word of this conference entitled Toward a Better Bluegrass. It's also, I guess, a burden to be entrusted with the opening word. I asked Richard, what do you want me to do with this first topic? He said, I don't know, just start off with a bang. Then I talked to my good friend Dan Lewis a few minutes ago, who was doing a breakout session right after mine. He said, hey, can you make the bar low for me? So if you like it, make Richard happy. If you don't like it, I've made Dan happy. So either way, I'll win, I suppose. Toward a Better Bluegrass, that little phrase, I think encapsulates my passion and calling in life. I founded an organization, as Richard said, called Christ for Kentucky, and one could easily summarize our work as a Christian ministry devoted to the goal of a better bluegrass. But what I have discovered as director of Christ for Kentucky is that people, particularly my Christian brothers and sisters, struggle to conceptualize the nature of our work that seeks to cultivate a better bluegrass. When Christians hear that we're an organization committed to a better Kentucky, they typically assume that we must be an organization committed to what you typically think of when it comes to Christian ministry, evangelism, discipleship, and so forth. And no doubt that is a part of our mission. We're actually currently developing and producing an evangelism curriculum based on the changes that we're seeing in this increasingly post-Christian secular society of ours, and that curriculum be free, easily accessible resource for others to make use of in that noble task of reaching our quickly changing commonwealth with the never-changing gospel. That makes sense to the average Christian. We understand that mission, evangelism, discipleship of our beloved Kentucky neighbors will lead to a better bluegrass, and we never want to neglect that truth. But that's not all that we do. It's part of our answer, but it's not the fullness of our answer. And so when I explain to people what Christ for Kentucky is trying to, I think my mic just go up. Y'all can hear me now? Is that here? Yeah. Thank you, whoever did that. When I explain to people what Christ for Kentucky is trying to accomplish within the spheres of Kentucky politics, business, academics, art, media, and so forth, it's these endeavors that tend to be puzzling to Christians. We understand why evangelism is crucial to a better bluegrass, but we struggle to understand why better businesses, for example, are crucial to a better bluegrass. The former seems like a sacred Christian endeavor, while the latter seems like a secular, worldly endeavor. And I think that's probably the challenge behind today's discussion. You probably are excited by the title of this conference, Toward a Better Bluegrass, but then you might be confused or even hesitant by the byline description of this conference, Sources of Kentucky's Economic Growth. What does the economic strength of Kentucky have to do with the Christian mission of cultivating a better bluegrass? In this introductory lecture that will kind of frame today's discussion, I hope I will clear up that tension so that you're prepared to hear from much more qualified speakers as they put forth a Christian vision of economic prosperity within this commonwealth that we all love. As my title suggests, my goal this morning is to demonstrate the dignity of work and wealth. And I'm just going to divide my talk accordingly. We're going to consider the first, the dignity of work, and the second, the dignity of wealth. Let's start with our calling of work. The Christian theology of work begins way back at the beginning of God's design for humanity in Genesis 1:27 through 28. It says, so God created man in his own image, and the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And then God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth. So what we see in these foundational verses of the Christian anthropology is that first and foremost, we are created in the image of God. And what this means is that God has entrusted to us certain divine, communicable attributes that the Creator does not share with the rest of creation. So unlike animals, which are just purely instinctual, we are these special creatures endowed with the capacities of creativity and ingenuity and self-contemplative thought and ambitions and goals. There's just something different between us and the rest of creation. And what is different is this indelible mark of God's image within us. But notice there is a reason. There's a purpose. There's a telos to the image of God within our design. After creating us in his image, God immediately says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over all the earth. God did not aimlessly create us in his image. God created us in his image for a purpose. And the purpose is to have dominion over all creation. God's image was designed to reign on earth, equipped with unalienable attributes of the Creator in order to rule as these ambassadors of the Creator over his creation. Meaning this, I have equipped you with all that you need to be my representatives and fulfill my purposes in creation. Now it work. Quite literally, it worked. I think there is this misnomer that if our fall into sin never happened, we would have just frolicked about the Garden of Eden forever. This is simply untrue. We would have advanced and developed the world just as humans have done. Only the cultures and the cities and the economies and the technology and institutions and so forth that we developed would have glorified God and blessed creation. This is why theologians refer to the call to fill the earth and have dominion over it as a cultural mandate. But if you are familiar with Christian teaching, you know that's not what transpired. Or more precisely, it did transpire, but not according to God's design. In the very next chapter, Genesis, of course, image bearers rebel against the God they were creating to image. Because of this, we now enact that original cultural mandate with sinful ambitions. We have filled the earth, but not for God's glory and the good of creation, but rather for our glory at the expense of creation. Human dominion has become human domination post-fall. And it has created an utter mess of creation within every sphere of human society: business, politics, media, education, technology, entertainment. No sphere is exempt from the corruption and selfishness and exploitation and so forth of fallen image bearers. And as much as I love Kentucky, this is the current state of our Commonwealth. It is said that when Daniel, who knows this is true, but I like this, said that when he crossed the Cumberland Gap and they've heard this, laid eyes on this state that we love, he responded that heaven must be a Kentucky kind of place. And as one with a nostalgic love for Kentucky, I love that quote and want to agree with it. But sadly, I must confess that our Commonwealth is no heaven on earth. And yet this is our dream for Kentucky. When we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, this is what we are praying for. That the kingdom and will of God will be done in Kentucky as it is in heaven. And when I say Kentucky, I don't just mean the citizens of Kentucky. Not just laboring to see souls of Kentuckians go to heaven one day, but literally that heaven would come to Kentucky. Indeed, that one day Kentucky will be heaven on earth. Not just the redemption of people, but the redemption of creation. How does this come to pass? Well, the plan has not changed from its Genesis 1 origins. God has still entrusted to us as his image bearers dominion. Only now, the cultural mandate to subdue the earth becomes this subversive campaign of re-subduing, reclaiming the spheres of society that have been co-opted by the parasitic nature of the fall. Reclaiming these spheres for the rightful owner, whom of course we believe is King Jesus. This is the essence of Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper's vision of sphere sovereignty. Kuyper was a Calvinist theologian and was invited by Princeton University to deliver the prestigious Stone Lectures. And his topic was on Calvinism. But he didn't lecture on what we would typically think of when we think of Calvinism, these often debated tenets of Calvinism, God's election, predestination, sovereignty and salvation, so forth. Instead, Piper lectured on politics, science, art, business, and so forth. Now, what in the world do politics and art have to do with God's sovereignty? The answer is everything. At the heart of Protestant Reformation thought is a God who is sovereign over all things, not just over individual souls as much as the entire cosmos. God is the rightful owner and ruler of his creation. Thus, Piper's famous line from those stone lectures, there is not one square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not declare mine. The risen and reigning Jesus Christ owns every square inch of the domain of human existence. And Christians believe this is true, but here's the problem. Does it look like Jesus owns everything? No, it does not. As a Christian, I may confess that God reigns over the bluegrass, but when I survey my beloved state, I see very little evidence that this is so. Do you see the dilemma that we are facing? We might say that the risen and reigning Jesus is in charge of every square inch of creation, but it sure doesn't look like he's in charge, which is precisely the point. That seemingly irreconcilable dilemma is what the followers of Jesus are expected to reconcile. You are not serving Jesus when you are participating in explicitly ministry work, evangelism, going on the mission trip, serving in your churches, whatever, or at work. But you're not serving Jesus only there. Rather, all of work is ministry. You are in service to Jesus every minute of every mundane day, because all of it is an opportunity to plant a proverbial flag in the ground of the spheres entrusted to you, saying this belongs to King Jesus, and it will function according to the ways of his kingdom. Waking up every day as viceroys of Jesus, making his invisible kingdom visible within the spheres that the King has entrusted to you. Just consider your personal vocation, whatever it may be. No matter the nature of that work, I am willing to bet that if I were to sit down and get to know your field of expertise, you would tell me it is filled with corruption and greed and selfishness and exploitive practices and so forth. But the point is not yours. You are going to work with this holy ambition. The vocation entrusted to me will function according to the ways of God's kingdom: righteousness, truthfulness, excellence, selflessness. Your work clothed with Christian virtue such that your calling is now viewed as a Christian calling, redeeming and reclaiming your sphere of Kentucky society for the glory of Jesus and the good of the bluegrass. Does that not motivate you? To know that it doesn't matter what you're doing, but what you're doing matters. Does this not hallow your seemingly mundane, weekly rhythms of life? But I've taught on this enough to know that there's a barrier to that motivation, and it is our cynicism. Come on, does this really work, right? Does this really change the bluegrass for the better? And I think this cynicism is rooted in America's results-oriented, immediate gratification expectations. But this is not the nature of the kingdom of God. The growth of God's kingdom is not viewed in Scripture as a triumphalist, immediate, even noticeable, reality, at least not until Jesus returns to, indeed, complete our work and make all things new. In the meantime, we find ourselves in this in-between, where the kingdom is spoken of with agrarian imagery in the Gospels, emphasizing slow, gradual, nearly indiscernible growth that is outside of our control. What it means is that it is far better for the Christian to conceive of their life's work less with triumphalist ambitions and more with the goal of preservation, rather than radical change-the-world expectations. It is far better to conceive of your life as what would this world be without you. Viewing yourself less as this radical change agent and more as a humble preserving agent. You are the salt of the earth. Salt was for them, and Jesus said those words, a preserving agent that slowed decay. And what Jesus is helping us understand is that the decay of this world would be much more putrid without your preserving presence. This is the brilliance of the classic Christmas film, It's a Wonderful Life. I'm going to spoil it here. It's out since 1947. Again, see it's your fault, not mine. So George Bailey is overwhelmed with the difficulties and futility of his life, so much so that he's driven to actually take his own life. But a guardian angel intervenes. And what's interesting about the perspective that the angel gives him, unlike the solution in Dickens' Christmas Carol that focuses on Ebenezer Scrooge himself, the perspective George Bailey is given is less about Bailey and more about the world without Bailey. He is given a glimpse of his community if he never existed, and it is a terrible world. All of the small and seemingly insignificant good deeds of George Bailey are taken out of the world, and because of this, the world is far worse off. This is how the Christian ought to primarily conceive of their impact in this world. Less a triumphalist presence and more of a preserving presence of salt and light, such that were you to remove your presence from your vocational field, from your sphere of society within this world, that sphere would be much worse off because of it. Less what you can do to radically change the bluegrass, and more what would the bluegrass be without you. So that is the dignity of work within the Christian worldview. Reclaiming, resubduing the spheres of Kentucky society where the true sovereign has made you sovereign, as this preserving agent living out your calling according to the ways of his kingdom. Before we move on, I want to speak to, in my experience, the two biggest obstacles I believe Christians face to living out this dignified vision of work. And it seems to me that these obstacles follow a generational divide. Forgive me for being for generalizing here, but the older among us and the younger among us are tempted by the same problem, only manifesting differently. The problem is the same. We are tempted to have a selfish view of our work, rather than viewing our work as an occasion to glorify God and bless Him. But again, that selfishness tends to play out differently. The older among us are tempted, it seems, to exploit their work for selfish gain. Work is merely a means of promoting myself, to gain power, to gain prestige, and certainly to gain more and more wealth, which we will talk about in a moment. This has become the cutthroat DNA of the American workforce for many generations. And that American impulse must be repented of. Work motivated only by selfish ambition does not serve the purposes of kingdom redemption, because it is a participation in the ways of fallen vocation that is all about me and not God's glory and creation's good. Now, what's interesting about the rising generation is that, frankly, they have an aversion to their parents' and grandparents' obsession with promotion and profits above all. That's actually taking place in the rising generation. Dan is going to be talking about some of this work in his breakout session. He's trying to do this noble work of giving the rising generation a vision of stewardship, financial stewardship, and giving and saving, and so forth. And I'm noticing this with the rising generation. Our youth are less and less motivated by the American dream of power and prosperity, but what tends to motivate them is a different form of selfishness. This is because they have been consumed with what Carl Truman calls the rise and triumph of the modern self. Our youth are all about discovering themselves, finding themselves, searching for that ever-elusive quest of an inner contentment, fulfillment, acceptance, and expression of their truest self, and this plays out in the way in which they approach work as well. No longer do they ask whether their job is a necessary and important contribution to society's common good, whether that work will allow me to provide for myself and my dependents. Now the question they ask is what? Am I fulfilled in my calling? Am I fulfilled in my calling? They are exploiting work not necessarily for promotion and profit, but to discover a sense of self-contentment. This is why they jump, you know this, they jump from career to career to career, searching to find their identity and fulfillment in work. But this too is approaching work with selfish ambitions and demands our repentance. Your work is not created for you to promote yourself or to find yourself. Work is created for you to nobly serve the Creator and bless the creation. So that's the dignity of work, according to the Christian worldview. Now, let's move from work to wealth. While the purpose of work is not necessarily the accumulation of wealth, it is the reality, according to many proverbs I could cite, a God-ordained reality that good, hard, honest work should receive compensation. And candidly, in a world that is increasingly exhausted with vocational corruption, doing things the right way, according to the principles of God, can typically lead to tremendous financial success. It's a good company to do it the right way. What is God's vision for the wealth that comes from our work, the wealth entrusted to our care? This won't take me as long to discuss because the principle is the same. Just like your work, your wealth is not to be exploited for selfish domination, but for selfless dominion. Not for your indulgence, but for God's glory and good of creation. Meaning, your wealth is to be viewed as an instrument toward a better bluegrass. We talked about redeeming work, vocation. Well, we need to talk about redeeming market, right? There's a historical moment in polling data in 2018 when the rising American generation officially crossed a tipping point in their economic preferences. It was the 2018 Gallup poll that showed 51% of Americans ages 18 to 29, so young millennials and older Gen Z, have a positive view of socialism compared to 45% having a positive view of capitalism. And this only begs the question of how something that has proven time and again not just to fail, but to destructively fail, how something that has been so historically unpopular in our society, there's a time, you know this, there's a time when socialist was the most feared label in our society. How it has suddenly gained not just acceptance, but trendy popularity among our youth. And there are a lot of hot takes being written trying to answer that question. And most of them are different spins on the same idea. Entitled youth who just want a bunch of free stuff. I think our youth deserve more respect than that uncharitable and simplistic explanation. I'm sure some of that is going on. But instead of dismissing the rise of socialism's popularity as purely the rise of entitlement, a much more humble approach is to sincerely ask, is it a reaction to something in our culture gone awry? And I think that might be the case. I recently read an interesting article about a new housing crisis that is upon us, and it's that there are no buyers for these massive, extravagant homes that Boomer built. There is simply no market for these extravagant houses. Quite frankly, millennials and Gen Z don't want them. There are no young buyers for the mansions that we have built. And I believe this is emblematic of the cultural shift that has taken place. I've already alluded to this, but the rising generation is, speaking candidly, disenchanted by the consumption and excess of their parents and grandparents. What if the rise of socialism among our youth was less about entitlement and more about a rebuke of sorts? A protest from our youth that are disgusted by our greed and overconsumption and want no part of it. I think that's the case. I believe in their minds, socialism is more about justice than it is economics. They are, after all, known as the justice generation. What you need to know about millennials and Gen Z, they are much more concerned about helping than accumulating. What stirs them is not more wealth and stuff, but actually the cause of justice. Now listen, can we critique how they go about justice and point out hypocrisy in their pursuit of justice? Yes. I've done that publicly. But at the end of the day, making a difference is more important to them than making a fortune. And then comes socialism, with its false promise of justice, and they flock to it. Of course, socialism has proven time and again to promise justice and deliver exploitation. But it's the hope of justice that has been so intriguing. So my contention is that it's not capitalism being rejected as much as greed capitalism. That is to say, they are rejecting the version of capitalism we have shown them, which in many cases is the selfish abuse of capitalism to feed our insatiable consumerism. What if instead of dismissing our youth, we were to listen to their rebuke? What if instead of mocking the rise of socialism, we reimagine capitalism? The assumption, the wrong assumption, is that capitalism is an inherently greedy system, meaning the very mechanism that keeps it flourishing is the love of money. But this is a false assumption. And I think it is Christians, in particular, who are called to challenge that assumption and demonstrate to the world a better way of doing economics, the way the Bible prescribes. It may come as a surprise to some, but the Bible is actually a revolutionary document on the issue of economics. What emerges from passages like going all the way back to Old Testament laws and Proverbs are innovative concepts of private ownership, free trade, and most of all, just transactions. We take these principles for granted, but that is only because we inhabit a culture where they are just assumed. Historically speaking, that is not the case until the 16th century, when Western Europe, influenced by the biblical worldview, began practicing what we now know as capitalism. And yet, despite the very tenets of capitalism finding their inception in the biblical worldview, the Bible, as you probably know, is often accused by some of espousing socialism. Now, how can this be? Because the Bible teaches the principles of capitalism and then applies those principles in a way that resembles what socialism vainly promises to offer. That is an economically just society. Meaning, the Bible retains private ownership, free and just exchange, but it turns around and expects that same private ownership and free exchange to be used not for personal gain, but for the good of man. I'll give you an example of that tension. Acts 2, the famous socialism passage that you may have had quoted before. It says this about the newly formed Christian community. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. As any had need, echoes the famous Communist Manifesto, each according to their need. But consider the verse again and see capitalism on plate. You had free exchange, private ownership. They were selling their possessions and their belongings. But at the same time, it sounds like socialism and distributing proceeds to all, to any who had need. So I guess you could say it's capitalism that ends in something that feels like socialism, which is precisely it. It is not state-mandated distribution of wealth. It is voluntary distribution of wealth. And this, my friends, is what our great sick world is dying to see. It is not the rejection of capitalism, nor is it the exploitation of capitalism. It is the redemption of capitalism. Reckless generosity rather than reckless consumption is what redeems capitalism. Again, the lie is that capitalism must run on greed. It doesn't have to run on greed. It can run on generosity just as effectively. The system still works that way. That is to say, you could accumulate wealth in order to give it away. Somebody over here before the thing, it's like, yes, people got to get rich so they can give it away. And I agree. The capitalism system still flourishes running on generosity. I think this might be one of the most compelling witnesses of the church in our day because it seems nobody lives like this in our culture. Even Bernie Sanders, the great prophet against wealth and champion of socialism, is ironically miserly with his money. When he's running for president, he released his tax returns, and it showed that he made far more than I made, $1.1 billion to be precise. Yeah, I believe this as a pastor, and now a pastor running a nonprofit, I'm not close to that. And at the same time, I gave away much more money than sinners. Now, don't be impressed by that, because he only gave $1,166 in charitable donations. 0.3 of his income. And the same year, he gave away $1,166. Senator Sanders purchased the third house, a waterfront vacation home for $575,000. Now listen, Bernie Sanders can spend his money how he wishes. I only point this out to show that even the very face of socialism in America is not impervious to the American entrapments of greed, consumption, and excess. I wonder how our greed, fatigue culture, and youth might respond to a counter movement that did capitalism. I'm telling you, this is utterly compelling to the rising generation. To show them it's not capitalism that's the problem, it's what we've done to it. Our greed, our extravagance, our hoarding, our gluttony of all things, all these things that we are exploiting capitalism to feed. The point I'm making is that capitalism doesn't have to work that way. Unlike socialism, it doesn't tell you what to do with your money. It can fund whatever you want it to fund, whether that be an extravagant lifestyle or an extravagant love of God and neighbor. And what I'm saying is that if we want to change the minds of our youth and curb the resurgence of socialism, then show them the way. Show them capitalism's unrivaled ability not just to create and accumulate wealth, but its unrivaled ability to unleash generosity. That is to say, private ownership existing for the good of the Blue Coats. Just like I held forth a vision of redeeming your work, well, God is also calling us for a vision of redeeming your market. The Apostle Paul says it like this: as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. Now notice that he does not condemn them for being rich. In fact, he even says that God provides everything to be enjoyed. So yes, enjoy what God has given you. But he also makes it clear that they are called to do something with their wealth that goes beyond their own personal enjoyment. They are to be generous and ready to share. I love that description, ready to share. It has the feel of someone eagerly looking for an opportunity to be generous. We are familiar with the idea of eagerly looking for an opportunity to make more money, to feed insatiable appetites, always looking for the next opportunity for wealth, to fund the next purchase, the next vacation, the next something you want. Paul has in mind those who are eagerly looking for the next opportunity to be generous. And you tell me whether capitalism done that way wouldn't be beautiful and compelling to the Blue Coats. It most certainly would. If you lament the rise of socialism, like I do, then you must demonstrate how redeemed capitalism can actually deliver what socialism has always vaguely promised. We must demonstrate the biblical principles of capitalism leveraged to accomplish the biblical ambitions of this conference toward a better world. Okay, that is enough. I left myself 10 minutes. Are you still wanting to do Q&A, or if I've exhausted them, we can be done? Questions? And it's okay if you have no questions, but any questions to that? Way in the back. I'll repeat it into the mic. You can yell. I find it things that a lot of people in my age are so focused on sharing the faith that don't understand that the person. Yeah. So he's asking, I guess you're saying, how do we help people see what I just said? Well, I mean, the obvious answer is there's plenty. There's not. I cited Piper and some of these other folks for a reason, because this has always been in the DNA of the historic Christian worldview and teaching. In every Christian tradition, it has always been this very robust vision for the Christian life that applies to every area of life. So, the easiest answer is just returning to that Christian tradition and helping, teaching it, helping people understanding, and incorporating that into the discipleship process. So that's the easy answer. It's not hard, but the strategic answer It's tapping into that nagging unrest that every Christian feels, which is simply, I know, okay, I go to church on Sunday, I got a Bible study during the week, maybe I'm trying to have an evangelistic conversation with a coworker or neighbor, I'm going on a mission trip once a year, I've got these Christian things I do in my life, and the rest of my life, the majority of my life, I live with this discontentment, maybe even burden of guilt of like, what am I even doing? Like, why am I even here? Tapping into that and helping them and helping I'm assuming about our youth, like our youth, helping them see God has something for you in the mundane. That again, what I said, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but what you're doing really matters. And just broadening out the vision for their life, they find so excited. Oh, I get to wake up and go to work, and it is an occasion to plant that kingdom of God flag in the ground and say, I'm going to do this according to the ethics of God's kingdom, and that matters. And it actually really does work. Again, keep them away from that radical, you're the Messiah of the bluegrass, and you're going to change Kentucky. But keep away from that, but just that question I asked of, what would that job be if you weren't there? How much more putrid and dark would it be without your salt and light presence in there, and just giving that greater vision to answer that nagging question that I'm sure they're feeling. What am I even doing? Good question. Good questions? All right. Yeah.
We do have some pastors here, and my observation that not a whole lot of pastors are talking about work and wealth and the things that you're talking about. Why is that? Can you tell us any ideas why that's happening, and what would you say to those pastors who they're intrigued by some of the things you're sharing?
Yeah.
What would you say to them if they're thinking about speaking? Here's the concern. I think that many congregants are worried that, man, if he's not sharing the gospel every Sunday, which that's part of the message that should come through, but maybe just diverging too much, isn't that the social gospel? I'll go in that direction. Isn't this
okay.
Right? Maybe the congregants wary of pastors speaking on something.
Right.
So that's what is happening, and what would you say to the pastor thinking about speaking to something like this?
Yeah, I'd say to the pastors, if you did hear that, it's like when you say pastors who feel like are hesitant to go into some of the areas I just went into out here, maybe it's sounding like a social gospel thing, turning the unchanging good news of gospel salvation into the social gospel of Christianity is just all about social good and common good and so forth. What I would say is you have to be a pastor who absolutely rejects the tenets of the social gospel, that you never, ever, ever, ever communicate to people in any way that we are saved by our good works and cultivating common good and feeding the poor and making a difference in the world and changing culture. That these acts do not save us. We're uncompromising in the gospel. So we do not at the church believe in the social gospel, but we absolutely do believe in a gospel that is social. And a gospel that has social implications. That Jesus does come to save us, but we dare not individualize his message of salvation. That the overflow of the gospel in our lives is all of this vertical gospel of reconciliation, overflow that is always expressed in social implications of the gospel, and never reversing those orders, but not being afraid to say the gospel has implications that go beyond it's just the good news of how you get to heaven. No, it's the good news that you now get to participate in heaven. Okay, yeah, oh, yes.
I'd like to ask you maybe a difficult question, but I think sometimes after being appropriately generous
Mm-hmm.
is sometimes hard work. Because trying to figure out, where to put my support, where it's actually going to do something beneficial.
Yeah.
And I think high wealth people have to have this issue.
Absolutely.
Where, I just don't want to throw my money out there.
Yeah.
And this is actually one of the critiques of big government programs where you get resources, but you don't really have to use those resources to improve yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's good to help people not starve or not have to,
Sure.
so on, be housed and so on, but you better help them improve their lives.
Yes.
So finding ways to that sort of generosity seems like it's much more difficult.
Yeah. You're talking about being thoughtful and strategic with your generosity. You don't want high capacity, those that God has entrusted with generational wealth, high capacity givers, they don't want to become like the federal government. That's just inefficient and wasteful in their generosity. I think there's a level, I'm not qualified, some speakers, now I keep coming back to them, but there are several speakers here who live in those spaces and think through how to help high net worth folks be thoughtful and strategic with their generosity. I think there's a lot of good resources out there. And Helping Hurts is also obviously the classic one. There's a new one that just came out on economics to common good or something like that. But there's tons of resources out to help you think through that. But please do hear don't hear what I'm not saying here. And when I say reckless generosity, I'm talking about in proportion to it makes no sense to Americans. It makes no sense to American society for you to be a person who sets first your standard of giving and then comes the standard of living. We all just set our ever-growing standard of living, and then we'll have a standard of giving on top of that, reversing that. And that's what I'm talking about extravagant. That people look at your life and say, whoa, like this is crazy. Like who does this with their wealth? How to do that effectively, I don't want to diminish that question. I actually am qualified. The only way I'm qualified to answer that question is about Thomas Preston, that people steward your money well, so you can donate to our ministry. and that's a fantastic way to be good steward of your finances. But outside of that, I just think that there's experts today who really can help people think through, whether in their talks or in conversations throughout the day, help people think through how do we be really thoughtful and strategic with our generosity so that it's efficient and we don't just turn into our own personal family. Good question. Yes.
Mr. Robert, I love what you said about being tactful.
Yeah.
And then the generosity and giving. We're basically talking about the second great command, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you
Yeah.
put it into action.
Yeah. And going back to Richard's point of the social gospel stuff and all of that, and I fear that our aversion to the social gospel and the social justice warrior movement and all that stuff, I fear that it has led to this unbiblical aversion to the fact that when asked, what is the greatest commandment, Jesus answered with two. That thus one commandment and two mean they can't be separated, which is you are to love God and neighbor. And you can't separate those two. And if you're ever in a Christian church or environment that takes away the love of God and does a secular religious or even really secular ethic route that's popular today of just love neighbor apart from love of God, you know something's wrong. But I think we should probably be humble enough, we who love God should probably be humble enough to consider, have we bought into the fallacy on the other extreme that it's possible to love God without loving our neighbor, and Jesus answers neither of these are possible.
Yeah, and appreciate you putting it back.
Yeah.
I'm going to somewhat answer the question, but
Okay.
also ask you to comment on it. In regards, I have seen some of the church, a lot of conflict in regards to, prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really the devil just trying to confuse all of us and keep us off mark. Goes back to what you said about the social gospel, in that from the standpoint of if you keep a focus on God and God's nothing on their life, all the rest of it will work out. And I just wanted to, if you could comment
Yeah, yeah, it is. In the Western church. Well, actually, that's not true, because what you're seeing in the developed world is an infusion of the prosperity gospel, kind of preying on world poverty with the false hope of Jesus is going to be America. So I think the prosperity gospel stuff is obviously very prominent in our society, and I would say that this is a form of reinventing the Christian faith in the image of America, and not the other way around. And please don't hear what I'm saying when I say, if you're faithful in your vocation and calling, if you love Jesus and trust Him and serve Him, that He is going to prosper you financially. He will prosper you. When the rich young ruler, when Jesus said to the rich young ruler, sell everything you have and give to the poor, it says he walked away because he had great riches. He walked away sad because he had great riches. And then Peter turned to Jesus and said, "What about us? We left everything, followed you. What's in it for us?" And Jesus gives a really interesting answer to that, where he says, "You have given up nothing. There's nothing you've given up to follow me that you won't receive back tenfold in this life and in the age to come." But what's interesting about when he talks about in this life, it's really weird, because he talks about the persecution and the loss that they're going to gain in the language of prosperity. And of course, the message there is that Jesus views a life of devotion to Him as a prosperous life. Even if you lose everything to follow Jesus, you are a flourishing human being, and you'll receive tenfold in the age to come, Jesus says. So I don't want to posture this lecture with a false hope that, hey, if you just follow this, you're going to get rich, and then you can be really generous with that riches. That's not what I'm saying. You may be in a field of vocation where living out a Abraham Kuyper sphere sovereignty, kingdom of God vision for your vocation will come at great cost. You might be in a field like that. I think several fields like that. Academics, media, art, politics. There are fields where trying to be faithful to King God and your vocation comes from the cost. There are also a lot of fields, though. Jim calls a good grade. He talks about those level of leaders, and what he says, that level 5 leader is set apart with all the things you normally have a leader. But essentially, what he's saying there is, but you at the same time have a leader who has character, humility, and godly principles. And that actually is a leader who tends to succeed. And that's what I was saying, is that in our current, in our world that's just getting so tired of all the corruption, if you have a business that does things the right way, you're probably going to have a pretty successful business. People are going to like it. And you might profit. You might profit because you're doing things the way of Jesus. All I'm trying to say is, it may come with costs, good. Bless Jesus still. It may come with profits, good. Bless Jesus and use those profits to leverage for a better business. I've got to stop. You want me to stop? Or? Okay. All right. Thank you all so much.
Robert, that was great. There's a reason why I wanted him to be our first speaker, and it's because what he talked about, God and the dignity of work and wealth, is foundational. And this tees up the rest of our conference. And Robert, you did a great job. Thank you. Let's give up for him again. I was asked by one of our tech guys to ask you all to put your phone on airplane mode, and the reason why is because we're streaming in a couple of different locations, and I guess the bandwidth is really narrow, so we want to make sure that we can record all of the different speakers. So if you don't mind, put your either on airplane mode or just don't use the conference Wi-Fi. Is what we want to avoid. So
just please, that will help us out greatly. Thank you for doing that. One thing I mentioned about Robert, he touched on this, I think, is he has a podcast called Every Square Inch. You heard him reference Abraham Piper. Great podcast. I encourage you to subscribe to that. Robert talks about these kind of things, work and wealth and the Christian's relationship to society and government and all these other areas of life. So I encourage you to check out his Every Square Inch podcast. And then also, since I mentioned his podcast, you mentioned Commonwealth Policy Center's podcast. We have a weekly podcast called The Commonwealth Minute. Robert has been a guest. I've had several other people. Daniel Cameron, legislators, Robbie Mills is here, Brian Dimitrovic, several other speakers on the agenda have been on The Commonwealth Matter. So please, if you would, subscribe to that as well. All right, we've got 10 minutes until our breakout sessions. The next breakout session right here, this is called the Barn. This is the Barn Ballroom. I'm going to be in here with Dan Lewis of the River Foundation and Jordan Tong of France Building Services, and we're going to talk about next-gen challenges. The other breakout session is on school choice and competition and education. That is in the Rockbridge Reserve. I believe it's out these doors and to the left, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. I didn't get a good look. Is that right? Is it out here and to the left? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That was my staff, by the way. I need to acknowledge all of you. You've all done a great job. Stand up. This is the CPC staff over here. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for helping to make this a great success. All right. With that said, one other thing. So once the next breakout sessions are finished, lunch is on your own. Again, as I mentioned earlier. And then on your, in front of your seats, you see my book, Christianity and Politics. That is for you. I'm going to be back in this room at 1:15. I'm going to do a Q&A, and then I will sign books as well. So if you care to come back here and ask me questions about that and for me to sign the book, I'd be glad to do that. All right, very good. Let's make it to our next session.
I remember.
Yes.
It was a little bit late.
It's fine.
Can you tell if it recorded?
It was doing well on Facebook.